and Esau for inviting me. Again, my name is Doug Workman, and I have been a ski guide for quite a while, based in Jackson, and worked actually for quite a long time up in Valdez with Don Sheriff. And I also work with Mammut North America. And a lot of what I do is train professional groups like search and rescue groups and ski patrols and guide services in what we at Mammut consider best practices for beacon search. And a lot of this is likely to be review for folks, but just some background. You know, obviously, I think most people know that have used a beacon, that a single target digital search with any brand of beacon, any brand of modern beacon, tends to be a fairly simple task. And once you start asking rescuers to search for multiple targets or deep targets, or search in difficult zones or areas like more industrial areas like ski areas or roadways with potential electrical interference, those searches can get more difficult. And originally, when I would go around to these groups, ski patrols and search and rescue groups and whatnot, I spent a significant amount of my time practicing the most advanced techniques for honestly the most unlikely yet complex scenarios possible. And while I still very much believe that those skill sets should be mastered by the professional user group, one of the things I noticed is that even amongst these very well-trained professional users, there was some fairly simple things, commonalities. I don't want to even call them mistakes, but things that clearly people could do better. And not only that, these were things that I think we all think that we're all doing. And I think one of the likely culprits behind this is that digital beacon searching is generally so easy that many of us don't feel that we need to practice. And I also think I've learned along the way some things we can do when we are practicing that are very specific. So when you go about your practice, rather than saying, I'm going to practice a beacon search, really asking yourself specifically, what parts of the beacon search are you practicing? So I use this airplane metaphor that you see on the screen a lot, and I use it for entry-level rescuers, and I use it for professional rescuers, because there is, it lays the groundwork, first of all, for what everybody should be doing, and it also gives us good cues for some of the more advanced techniques. So I have not asked Patrick or Frank or Blake or any of the other people who have easy access to speak with me, but I'm thinking it might be easier for me to incorporate them into this than ask questions of the greater group. But we clearly can do that as well. So if anybody does want to participate through the chat, I'll just open that window and make sure that is visible. So what I'd like to do is just start out by talking about each phase of the search, the signal search, the coarse search, and the fine search, and just talk about what are the core principles of how you perform each of those sections of search. And there's no wrong answers. Feel free to throw stuff out there, but I'd like to start by just asking Patrick or Frank or Blake or anybody else, if you were to teach your friend who was new to doing a beacon search, what are the core principles that you would want to impart on that person so that they hopefully could do a satisfactory signal search? So specifically, just the phase of the search when you are searching for the signal.
Yeah, so for me, I'm thinking about starting really broad before I'm working into something narrow. So I'm looking visually at whatever my path is and identifying kind of some of those boundaries, and then I might be thinking about, being able to rule out areas without missing any geographical areas as I'm going through my signal acquisition. I'll let Blake take it from there.
Yeah, and just to make sure that I'm understanding the question correctly, so we've already gone through the initial steps and now we're actively trying to find the signal, and we have not transitioned into a core search yet.
Correct. Yeah, you've turned your beacon to search and you do not have a signal. So by definition, you're searching for a signal and you're just trying to train your friend and, in a short, 10-minute little briefing on how they would perform that, how they interact with their beacon, how they hold their beacon, what they're looking for and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously I would second, what Pat just said about identifying your boundaries. I think one of the things that I noticed in our terrain is that people tend to move really quickly through that signal search, so much so that they kind of bypass either clues or really where the signal is actually being picked up to begin with. So and I like the airplane analogy that getting it off the ground and on the ground is probably the hardest part. So at the beginning here, to really just remember to move slowly as is reasonable in order to get that signal search, and to make sure that you have your head up looking for, as Pat said, any more obvious clues, i.e. somebody on top of the snow.
So Pat and Blake both said a couple things that I want to just capitalize on. Somebody used the word visual. Somebody else said keeping your head up. It's really worth, and interestingly, I think when most people practice searching, they practice in such a small area that when they turn the beacon to search, they instantly acquire a signal. So I don't really think actually that many people actually train in signal search. And again, I think people frequently think, well, that stage is pretty easy, so it doesn't really warrant the training that maybe another part of the search gives. But you said some really important things that I also think get overlooked. We all know that, with screens, it's very challenging for us not to always be staring at them. And I was doing a training with Aspen Highland Ski Patrol once, and I watched a ski patrolman turn their beacon to search, and they did not have a signal, and they put the beacon in their pocket. They put it away and continued down the path. And this was kind of an interesting moment for me, because my first thought was, what are you doing? Why are you putting your beacon away? But it actually really impressed on me something that I think gets overlooked, that you both stated, is that this is a visual search. This is something that you need to be doing with your eyes. You need to keep your head up. The vast majority of people that are caught and carried in avalanches are not fully buried. And it's really important to remember that but far and away, most people that you're ever going to search for at this stage are going to be found with your eyeballs. So if you're not looking with your eyes, if you're not performing the signal search primarily with your eyes, then you're really not focusing on what matters. At this point of the search, the beacon has arguably no information to give you. It has no audible sound of any significance, and there is nothing on the screen of any significance. There is no reason to be looking at it. And while I'm not sure that I would agree with it, that I would just put the beacon away, it is, if you ever try that, it really impresses upon you in a visceral way that this section of the search is going to be done just with you, no technology. So we really encourage people to get that beacon out from in front of their face. Unfortunately, we still see large numbers of people looking at the beacon, and it is very possible that they're going to miss a leg or an arm or a body part or a clue if they're staring at their screen. So we generally advise people to hold it up at their ear so that when signal acquisition does occur and your beacon does give you a sound at that point, that you're not going to miss that. So that to me is a critical piece, is do not look at your beacon. Search the terrain with your eyes. And again, we advise putting it up here just so that it's closer to your ear. So there's some other stuff that, some other kind of core principles of the signal search that have not been mentioned. Now, what should the rescuer do in terms of how they move down the slope? So as the metaphor shows, a plane that's at altitude traveling across a continent, you can be moving very fast. If you don't have a signal yet, that it means by default you're very far away. And the most important thing at that point is that you're moving fast and that you're running in a pattern that ensures that you're searching that entire area. So what types of patterns might you run to ensure that? And with what types of parameters, what types of distances? Anybody, Frank or anybody else?
I think sometimes the answer depends on the path characteristic. What's the shape of it? How big is it? A lot of times you're going to see some sort of a zigzag. You're going to see some sort of a more right angle box situation. And the key there is that when you're making those turns, so when you're going to change direction, you want to have confidence that when you do change direction, that the length of your beacon signal is going to overlap with kind of the next turn you're going to make, and that way you're not going to miss an area, if that makes sense.
Okay, so what I'm going to latch onto there, Patrick, is you said the length of your search area. What I'm searching for here is what is the range of your beacon. And it's a really critical thing. And I've noticed that when I get large groups of people who have all received a lot of training, a lot of people don't know what the range of the beacon is. And part of the thing that makes that tough is that different manufacturers and different models even have different ranges. But it's super critical that you understand the performance of your beacon. Okay? So you need to know the range, and you also need to know what all manufacturers refer to as the recommended search strip width, which is the distance between your zig and zag. It's obviously based on range. And it's important to understand how those manufacturers come to that recommended search strip width, because among other things, you need to be able to trust it. Okay, so it's worth noting that beacons have a best coupling, which tends to be when the long antennas are in line or parallel. And you have a worst possible coupling when those antennas are perpendicular. Okay, so with even a very old analog beacon, this is an Ortovox F1, you had a recommended search strip width of 80 meters. With the Mammut Varivox S, you've got a recommended search strip width of 70 meters. And how all manufacturers arrive at that recommendation is based on the worst possible coupling, the perpendicular coupling, and the worst possible range. So with this modern beacon, you have a range that could be up to 70 meters or even more in an analog setting. And in its worst set coupling, that may only be 35 meters. And so it's important to recognize that your recommended search strip width tends to be double the range in your worst coupling. Okay, because to use the zigzag that's shown in the screen icon in under signal search there, you are essentially searching 35 meters below you when you're doing your zigzag, and then you're achieving 35 meters above you when you're below the zigzag, which ensures that you're searching the whole thing. And obviously that is effective even in worst coupling 100% of the time, which is extremely unlikely to be. So meaning that there's a lot of margin built into this, and you're certainly searching that entire area if you're doing a zigzag with this particular beacon with its recommended search strip width of 70. Now, frequently people will just throw out the random number when I ask them, what is the search strip width of 40? Okay, that's just like this generic number that gets taught, okay? And my point here is that if you are underutilizing the technology in your hand, which a lot of people do, then you are moving inefficiently and you're searching much more thoroughly than is necessary, which in a small Avalanche is not necessarily critical. But if you are unfortunate enough to search for a large Avalanche or be in a situation where you're understaffed, under-resourced, you want to be able to use the technology in hand to its full capability. But clearly, the worst thing to do, which I've watched several professionals do, is run a pattern that is too wide, thereby missing the target altogether. And again, that tends to be something that's thought of as being so simple that we don't practice. And maybe you even know what the range of your beacon is quantitatively, like you may have read the manual, you know that the recommended search strip width is 70 meters. But what does that actually look like in a piece of terrain? So it's essential, I think, that you go out and you look at it. You examine the range of your beacon and you visually figure out what does that look like and what is that going to feel like on a 35-degree slope while managing hard slab debris or broken trees. Okay, so these are simple things that people can do to refine their search and become better searchers. That again, what I've found is that even professional users are not training themselves to do. And you know, it's just some low-hanging fruit for all of us, regardless of your level of experience, to become a better rescuer. And the only other thing that I would say there again is speed, speed, speed. You know, making sure that there's no way you can pass the target, miss the target, and end up at the bottom of a 1,000-foot bowl or couloir beneath them. Okay, but fairly simple. Does anybody have any questions there with signal search, or anything that is different what they would have expected, or contrary to what they've learned? Or all right, then I'm going to move on. So course search. I don't know if I have the ability to call on people, but the next name on my screen is Frank. So I'm going to ask Frank, how do you teach course search to your buddy? Okay, I'll go to the next name. What about Joe? No? All right, back to the top. Pat, how do you teach?
I'm back with you, Doug.
Okay.
It takes me a second to figure out which mute button's working. Yeah, with the course search, I teach my buddy to ignore the arrows, make the numbers get smaller.
Okay.
Simple,
I like how you sorry, I interrupted. I like how you prioritized the number over the arrow. It's very important that we all think about and recognize that your beacon, regardless of brand or model, your beacon communicates to you in 3 different ways. Your beacon has an audible tone, your beacon has a direction arrow, and your beacon has a distance indicator. And as Frank said, the number is far and away the most important piece of the equation here. If you had to teach somebody in under a minute, the simple way to do it is say, make the number go down, right? And the arrow is a tool that helps, you know, clue in terms of where the beacon thinks you should be moving. But I think what Frank was saying, he said, ignore the arrow. I'm not sure that I ignore it altogether. But it is important to recognize that arrow, again, with any brand of beacon, can be 180 degrees wrong because of the way radio signals work. And if the arrow is sending you in a direction where the number is starting to go up, then you should simply turn around 180 degrees and the arrow is very likely to correct. So number is the most important. The direction indicator is maybe the next important. And I would say that the tone is the least important. And for the older people in the audience, that might be hard to understand or believe, because with an older analog beacon, the sound was the single most important piece of the puzzle. But it's really important to recognize here that with digital beacons, the sound is really nothing more than encouragement. We could all go into a sound lab and say, well, what do we want the sound to be when we acquire the signal? And someone might say, I want fireworks. Okay, great. We're going to go with fireworks. And then, what's it going to sound like when you're at a great distance? Okay, low, long tones. And then as you get closer, you're going to increase the cadence, increase the pitch. Those are all things that encourage the user. They may allow the user to look at the screen a little bit less, which is an added bonus. But generally speaking, they're telling you what you should already know because you have the number. So clearly, this stage of the search, which starts when you acquire a signal and ends when your beacon reverts into its fine search mode, is clearly the easiest part of the search, right? It's the hardest one to mess up. And because of that, there aren't a lot of notable tips. But what I do tell people is when you're far away, we want you following the arrow, making sure the number goes down. But we don't really care if the arrow is perfectly centered or not. Okay, if the arrow, as it shows in this image, is slightly off to the left or the right when you're at 50 or even 40, we don't really care. We just want you moving really quickly, and we want that number going down. But there is a point, because the closer you get, the more accuracy is going to begin to trump speed in terms of priority. There is a point during the course search where accuracy takes a heightened importance. And that number for us is 10. And we teach people that when you are at 10, you're now like the pilot who can see the airport. And now you really need to make sure that you're lined up. So we do teach that below 10, we want you to pay a lot of attention to that arrow, and we want it dead center. Some things we haven't mentioned is that we're teaching people to hold the beacon at their waist and hold it at an arm's length. Any ideas as to why we would want it at arm's length? An arm's length away from your body. That's to keep it as far away as possible from any electronics that are on your body. Unfortunately, electrical interference continues to become a bigger and bigger problem as we're carrying around essentially computers for our phones, and people have lots of Bluetooth. It is important to recognize that it is not sufficient to put your phone in airplane mode. That does not solve the problem at all. I can even demonstrate to you how a phone, when turned off, if it's in close enough proximity to the beacon, it will still create interference, as will any piece of metal. So we hold it at arm's length to make sure it's far away from our radios and our cameras and our phones. But then back to this magic spot of 10. Why below 10 do we really care that that arrow is super centered? And the reason is that the next part of the search, the fine search, is arguably the most difficult part of the search that exists. It is the part of the search that requires the most skill. And so we want to talk about that. And we want to reduce the amount of fine searching that anybody is ever doing. And we do that by keeping our arrow centered from 10 and onwards during course search, to ensure that when your beacon switches into whatever it's going to do during fine search, that you are that much closer to the victim, okay? And I believe that we as a community, whether you've been an Avalanche educator, when I think of the Avalanche courses I've taken, when I think of the Avalanche courses I've taught, there's only been one time, really, when I was trained to search for life-size targets. And that was actually when I was a student at Knowles doing drills that Don Sheriff set up. And he would always bury 6 6-foot-long duffel bags. And why don't we typically see that in Avalanche education? And the reason is simply that we're lazy. It's difficult, it's arduous, and it's time consuming to set up drills with life-size targets. So as a result, maybe if you're out with your buddies, sometimes you throw a beacon in a glove, or maybe you put it in a small piece of Tupperware, or maybe you actually bury a backpack, which is larger, but still not a realistic life-size target. Guide exams in Canada are 30 centimeter by 30 centimeter strike plates. Those are still very unrealistically small. They just this year, I believe, at the American Mountain Guides Association, increased the strike plate size to 45 centimeters by 45 centimeters, which is larger, but is still not anywhere close to a life-size target. And I bring this up because of the saying, and I'm probably going to butcher it, that they have in the military, where fight like you train, and train because you're going to, train like you fight because you're going to fight like you train. And I very much believe that by searching for unrealistically small targets, we have trained ourselves to search in a way that is not optimized. So some of the things that you typically see. So first of all, during course search, to back up a little bit, we talked about how you're intentionally turning the axis of your beacon so that the arrow is centered. You're holding it at waist level and intentionally turning the axis of that beacon. Well, again, regardless of the brand of the beacon, the common practice, the best practice whenever you get to fine search, which is generally about 3 meters, is whatever axis you've come in on, that beacon is to remain in that axis. Okay. What else gets taught in terms of how you do the fine search? Somebody throw something out there.
Can I just throw out a question from the audience to you, Doug?
Yes, please.
So one of them was, you answered, I think, about the effect of signal interference with cell phone, but also somebody was asking more specifically about emergency beacons, like a spot or a inReach or something like that.
Yeah, it's a really simple answer. Just go back to metal. Anything that is metal has an electromagnetic field around it. And that electromagnetic field sounds to a listening device like static, just like white noise, hissing. The more severe the static, the louder it gets. And at some point, it gets so loud that it overcomes the volume of the beep coming from the beacon. Okay, the white noise basically just obscures the sound, and you've got this listening device that you're trying to use for this rescue, and it simply cannot hear the beeps, even though they're out there, because the static noise is so loud. So a lot of beacons now have warnings when they can hear that static. I frequently carry my beacon in my pocket, kind of near my abdomen and groin. And if I get on a ski lift, it quickly starts screaming at me and says, 457 error. That's just an electrical interference indicator. Or the new Barryvox S has an icon that has, a phone with a line through it. Okay. So there's a lot of beacons out there that can identify when electrical interference is happening so that you can adjust your search techniques. But the simplest thing is to move away from the offensive device, create distance, which is why during course search, we're telling you hold your beacon at arm's length, because we strongly suspect you have an iPhone or a VHF radio or some other potentially offensive device. There are situations where you cannot move away from the offending device. For example, if you're performing a rescue in bounds and there's a lift tower or a chair lift in the avalanche debris, well, you're not going to be able to just move away from it. And there are techniques in place that can help you effectively deal with that, namely just increasing the resolution of your pattern, meaning either if you're in signal search, narrow or zigzags, and that forces you to get closer to the target at the expense of what would normally be considered efficiency, right? So you're accepting the fact that I'm going to run a tighter pattern, which will increase, force me to get closer to the target, which will make it essentially louder to hopefully overcome that noise. But obviously, with the, there are actually no papers that I have ever seen that compare the potential for electrical interference between different types of electronics, but there's not a doubt in my mind that a Spot or a Garmin or an InReach, simply because it is electronic, it has an electromagnetic field that it has the potential to create electrical interference or white noise that can get in the way of a search. Generally speaking, if you have 50 centimeters of distance between your searching beacon and your offending device, it should be more than enough to separate and clarify that search. If you were buried in an avalanche, you would very hopefully have a minimum of 20 centimeters between your beacon, which is sending a signal, and any potential offensive device. So you really do want to think about where are you putting your iPhone, where are you putting your radio, and in what sorts of positions could you get buried? Because if those devices ever were with, closer than 20 centimeters in a burial position, you could be very difficult to find. Did that answer the question about the Garmin?
Yeah, sounded good to me.
So just to backtrack a little, we know that find search is difficult. We know that if you watch a lot of professionals doing find search, they don't do it nearly as methodically as you would think, partly because it's just difficult to move through real avalanche debris on a real slope. And even though we teach and know to keep your beacon in a fixed axis and to keep it at the same distance above the snow and to move slowly, it's just difficult to do those things in actuality. Okay, so we very much want to reduce the amount of find searching that is required. Okay, so below 10, we keep that arrow really pinpoint. Okay, and now you're in find search, you're keeping your beacon in a fixed axis. What else do we teach people at that point? Okay, the two things that you commonly hear are get down on the snow surface and move really slowly. And I just want to talk about that a little bit because I would argue that there is a slightly better way to do it. You very frequently will hear people say, get down on the snow. And by doing that, you have maybe gotten an additional, let's say, as compared to just holding the beacon at your knee, you've gotten yourself 15, 20 centimeters closer to the snow surface. Not very much. So you get a little closer to the snow surface and the target. And now you see some people virtually crawling over or severely hunched over on the snow, making it very difficult to move. You're not in a very ambulatory position. Okay, and you've only achieved getting 15 centimeters closer. I would say it's not worth it. Okay, we teach just get the beacon to your knee, keep it in a fixed axis, and you probably can move a half a click faster than you think. So we typically see people moving too slowly and too close to the snow surface. And I want to go back to target size and why I think that happens. And quite simply, if you're looking for a target that's very, very small and you know it, well, then accuracy is going to be incredibly important, especially if the way you've set up your drill is as it should be, is that you have to hit the target with a probe before you dig. If I had the ability to bury this tape measure that happens to be sitting on my desk, it's, about, smaller than a beacon. And I were to tell your team, I have buried this tape measure. And we're going to do a competition to see who can hit it first with a probe. You're not allowed to use a shovel at all. If I were to send that team off to race, I'm quite certain that what you're going to see is people in fine search moving extraordinarily slowly, extremely close to the snow surface. And they're going to do an enormous amount of grid searching, which is seen in this slide, forward, back, left, and right, paying a great amount of detail to the difference between 2.1 and 1.8. Okay. Now, compare that to how people are going to behave if I have the ability to bury an F-150 truck. And once again, I say, first one to hit it with a probe wins the competition. You win $1,000. And I send the team off racing for this F-150. I'm quite certain, and I would be surprised if anyone disagreed, that what you're going to see is no grid searching. People are going to run in on their course search, and as soon as they see a remotely low number on the screen, they're going to start probing, and they're very likely to get a probe strike without having to perform any grid searching. And clearly the F-150 is also not a realistic size target, but the moral of the metaphor there is that people need to start probing sooner. The probe is what finds the victim, not the beacon. If somebody is spending an enormous amount of time trying to figure out the difference between 1.7 and 2.0, they're wasting time. And while they're doing that, they're walking around on the snow surface even more, which, as you know, is compressing the snow underneath even more, which is going to make it that much harder to excavate the snow, which is the next step. So for many reasons, we believe people are over searching in fine search. So what we frequently teach for there's different ways to go about this, but the one universal is that below 10, we want that arrow pinned at center to increase your accuracy during the final stages of course search so that far less grid searching would be required. We then teach that when you are doing fine search, of course, you're keeping the beacon in a fixed axis. We also teach only going to the knee so that you can remain in a more ambulatory position, which also allows you to keep the beacon at a fixed distance above the snow surface, even if you have to step over a tree trunk or a large piece of hard debris. It's much easier to keep that level. And I think if people start training for realistic sized targets, you'll find that you can probably move faster in that stage of the search than you would think. You're still moving slower relative to the speed of during course search or signal search, but I think most that you'll find if you play with target size, that you can probably be moving faster than you think. And then for the maybe call them recreational users, certainly for somebody who really doesn't practice this stuff very frequently, we would argue that it's probably good enough to find the lowest number on that single first fixed axis and just start probing from there, knowing that you might have to do 3 rotations of your spiral of probing instead of 2, okay? But it's far easier to teach someone how to be a good prober than a good grid searcher. That's a skill set that requires much more practice and much more methodology. So
So.
It looks like you have a question, Blake.
Yeah, Doug, I really appreciate the emphasis on how important that getting to that stage of probing is. So we've been looking through the lens of a single searcher. If during that core search, I have, let's say, one, perhaps even two other partners that are with me, they were part of that signal acquisition. Now, one person, likely all three beacons are probably going to pick the signal at the same time. How might I expedite that search at the end for a probe strike in that core search phase?
So I think what you're asking is how to maximize multiple rescuers to search for multiple targets. Is that fair?
That would be yes.
And I don't have a boxed answer for that, so I'm thinking a little bit, but I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with your ability to have a map in your head for where these targets potentially are. And that comes back to knowing the technology in your hand. And, you know, they're not all the same. They don't, you know, beacons, there's a lot of different brands out there. There's a lot of different models out there, and they all kind of come out at a different angle. If you're using a beacon that has a marking function, there is a chance that that beacon also has a scrolling function. So any beacon that has a marking function is based on technology that involves signal separation algorithms, which is a fancy way of just saying that it's figured out how many targets are out there and which one is generally the closest and which one is generally the farthest away. And because that tends to be a fairly simple in practice to use a beacon with marking, people think that it's fairly simple, but it's actually a very large lift for a beacon. The easiest example of what I think you're asking the beacon to do when you're asking it to separate all those signals is, imagine walking into the entryway of your favorite tavern in North Conway, and with your back to the bar, you have to tell me how many people are in the bar and who is the closest to you and who is the furthest away. And then you have to hone in on the closest one and only listen to that one and tell me what that person's talking about, okay? So there's a lot of noise, and the beacon is being asked to, you know, separate a lot of information. If your beacon has the ability, gives you a list of buried subjects, you may also have the ability to scroll through those and confirm that your beacon is going to the closest victim. That can also help you figure out if the victims that you're headed to are close together or not. If they're not close together, then you might be able to tell a different searcher, hey, you know, I'm 7 meters from this one. I'm going this way. You know, I want you to search, you know, a different quadrant of the possible burial area and see if you pick up a signal that way. That's my off the cuff answer, but essentially you're being forced to do triage by saying to the rescuer, hey, I don't want you going this continued searching to this one that your beacon's taking you to. So you've got to force your beacon to pick up another signal by moving just in a different direction.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions?
There's one here, Doug, in a similar vein from Mona. If you have a second person who can probe, so I'm guessing, you know, two rescuers, one burial. Second person who can probe, would you suggest over searching with the beacon?
Well, I'm not sure I understand what's meant by over searching.
I think the spirit of the question is, if you have two people for one burial, what's the most efficient way to use both people?
To me, and if I'm not effectively answering the question, just let me know. But to me, the thing to remember that we already just touched on is that the probe is the tool that finds the victim. So the faster you get to probing, the better. So to go back to that airplane metaphor, you know, if I have my probe out, because say I'm assisting Blake is doing the beacon search, and I have confidence in Blake's ability to do a beacon search. So I'm going to go ahead and get my probe and my shovel out and follow him. Of course, having my beacon in a setting, which is not going to make it more complicated for Blake. And then as soon as Blake is getting anywhere close to the victim, and I know that simply because of watching him and his behavior, if he's got his beacon down at his knee and he's landing the plane, then I know he's close. And I would encourage that auxiliary rescuer to be just hastily spot probing any likely areas near Blake. And I would say that there's a very good chance you're going to get a probe strike before anybody has completed any sort of fine searching. So that would be another very effective way to eliminate or reduce the amount of fine searching required, which should always be a goal.
Sweet. Another question from Kyle. If I have a Berry box on the EU frequency, can I use it in North America, or do I need to reorient the frequency of the beacon?
Yes, you can definitely use it in North America. That frequency is only a subset, essentially a secondary tool that we use to wirelessly do firmware updates and change settings and do diagnostic testing on the beacons. There will be a slightly enhanced performance if you're using the correct W-Link frequency. But that performance boost would only be noticed between searching for a Berry box with a Berry box. If the beacon that you're searching with is in an EU W-Link setting, you will notice no difference in performance if you're searching for a different brand of beacon that is not W-Link enabled. It would essentially be like turning your W-Link off, which most beacons don't even have a W-Link. So I would say it's not overly concerning. I would say get it adjusted when you can to maximize performance, but it certainly is not like your beacon just can't be used.
Sweet. All right, message from Ken. Great food for thought on simplicity and speed, but I'm struggling with not doing the grid, especially on a deeper burial. Seems like you could end up quite a ways off target. Does it come down to just 3 versus 2 probe spirals? Not sure about that last point, but if you could speak to that.
And this was did you say Ken or Kent?
From Ken, yep.
Yeah, so Ken brought up a very important point. Yes, that would not apply for a deep burial, but you know, I was presenting, and I should have clarified that, you know, the vast majority of burials are shallow burials, and so that technique of minimizing grid searching is effective for shallow burials. And I'm not saying never do a left or a right pass, but I'm saying for a large number of users, it's easier for them to be a good prober than to be a super effective grid searching. And I think we overemphasize the necessity of that grid searching. For a more advanced user, or a user that's been able to identify that the lowest number was actually a relatively high number, anything over 2.5 would definitely be considered a deep burial, and more grid searching in that case is certainly going to be very valuable. I'd say that's a very, very good point he brought up.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of times people get kind of disassociated with the number and what it means in real life. You know, if you have something that's half a meter or just over, I mean, in reality, that person is right there. So it kind of speaks to what you're saying. Here's a question from, what do you think about the new voice technology with OrtaVox, if you know anything about that? Somebody was wondering.
I don't know much about it. I did get to play with it this last weekend at YSAW. The OrtaVox rep, Adam Worth, was there, and he let me play with it for a little while. You know, I think that all advances in technology are great. And anything we can do to create user interfaces that are more intuitive is great. I still stand by the fact that in terms of a priority of what your beacon, how your beacon is communicating with you, that the number is the most important. The direction arrow is the next most important, and any sound coming out of a digital beacon is the least important. I don't need sound at all. If someone gave me a track or two that had a broken speaker, my ability to search would not even be remotely inhibited. I just make the number go down and follow the arrow, right? I can do grid searches. I can do more advanced techniques like 3-circle methods or micro search strips. I lose nothing when I lose digital sound because all it is encouragement. Does that mean that encouragement is not valuable? No, it just means it's not essential. So I would say that voice activation is taking encouragement to the next level, and maybe will continue to have future value, but it certainly does not change the game.
Awesome. Blake or Frank, or I'm sorry, actually, Doug, have you gone through your presentation material before I start to ask for any questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I only have one slide. This is a super low-tech presentation, but I think I've really hit on what I wanted to hit on in terms of just trying to get people thinking about how they can be better searchers and what common things we're all doing that maybe are not the actual best practices. So yeah, any questions would be great.
Hey, Doug, can you hear me?
I can.
Just curious if there's anything in the industry trending towards making either the audio signals or some of those functions designed to elicit certain responses from the people searching, if there's an effort towards making those universal rather than proprietary, so that people can be more fluid when going from one device to another.
There is nothing that I know about that encourages manufacturers to work together to make things more universal. And while I agree it would be easier to move from one device to the next, I tend to think it probably would also inhibit innovation if there wasn't that competition between the manufacturers. So at the end of the day, I think it's a good thing that there's competition, but I do know that it makes it more difficult. But no, I don't think there's really anything that's pushing manufacturers to create any sort of universality between the way that they're approaching these things. And the one thing I would say, what's that?
Oh, sorry. I just have a follow-up question is the audio function that's been added. What's the real driver for manufacturers to not just have analog audio of the actual signals themselves coming in? It's a function on like advanced beacons, like some of the beacons that you guys make, where you can just keep analog on. Personally, I find when I go from coarse search to fine search and I get a shrill digital beacon, I find that adding a stress level to an already stressful situation, rather than an analog signal where I can actually start listening even and possibly hear a second beacon in the fray, and kind of bypassing the digital processing. What's the driver behind that? Is it just about making it easier for folks just starting out, or? Yeah,
well, first of all, I've tried not to speak to anything that is specific to BerryBox, because I want this to be, as applicable to as many people as possible. But since you're asking, again, I think that digital audio is encouraging. And just to backtrack there on that Ortovox question about the beacon that's speaking to you, the one piece I also wanted to say is I do think it's interesting that that beacon that's speaking to you is very much sounds like the way your GPS in your car sounds. That's the way it's speaking to you. And similarly, the way that the software on the BerryBox S works when you're doing this grid search. I haven't talked about it much, but you can see those icons are very similar to a GPS where you've got that, that arrow on the road. And I do think that that's an interesting route that is kind of being taken by many beacon manufacturers in different ways, because the more familiar that user interface appears, and if it really does build on the familiarity we already have with GPSs, I do think that that is a cool thing that I picked up on when I saw that Ortavox. In terms of the analog sound, Vox has always believed since the first digital beacon that they made, which was the Opto 3000, I think in 1998, that digital technology was a game changer. It made everybody a faster searcher far and wide when BCA came out with that technology. When you start to, and it made single beacon searches so easy that very quickly manufacturers were looking at like, well, now that these single searches are so easy, we should be trying to make multiple burial searches easy as well. The problem with digital beacons that are trying to make sense of multiple burials is that when that listening device is trying to figure out how many voices do I hear, it really has to hear enough of that person speaking, so to speak, that they can identify that it's one signal. So where the human ear can hear one beep and they can instantly know that there's a signal out there, the beacon that is looking to use signal separation algorithms needs to hear more than one beep. It needs to see a pattern and hear a pattern. And the problem with that, so that's an analog signal. I don't know if you can hear that. And the second you hear that analog receiver go from silence to sound, that very millisecond, the human ear knows there's a signal there. Whereas a digital beacon that's trying to build up a list of buried subjects, it's going to want to hear several beeps, maybe 3, before it feels confident in saying there's a victim there. And because it wants to hear that it's in a rhythmic pattern and that it's all part of one thing. As soon as 2 beacons beep at the same time, which is what we refer to as signal overlap, then the beacon's ability to confidently tell you how many victims are out there is completely thrown awry. Okay, so if you think that there is any likelihood that you're dealing with that situation, then having analog tones is extremely beneficial because the human ear is so much faster at discerning that information. But that is definitely something that takes more advanced practice and skill and methodology. It's not that easy in a high pressure situation to do any form of deductive reasoning. So that's something that you definitely need to have a strategy for beforehand and practice, because just having analog sound is not enough. You're not going to be able to really figure out how to use it in conjunction with digital. But yes, Frank, the short answer to your question is that we've always believed that for the most complicated searches especially, that having analog sound in conjunction with digital distance and direction indicators and marking is far and away the most effective way to deal with the most complicated scenarios. That being said, those complicated scenarios should be rare, although, as they're certainly not as rare as they used to be when you look at the multiple burial scenarios going on, an increase in that. And it used to be, I think, that we could all say, oh, well, if there was a multiple burial scenario, then obviously somebody messed up so badly that you could kind of almost shame someone from even thinking about that. I, for one, know when I'm skiing a run on Teton Pass or even in the park nowadays, that it's very rare that I can say with any sort of absolute confidence that there aren't multiple people below me. And it's also very rare that I can say that there aren't people above me. The mountains have gotten really crowded really fast. And as we saw with the Ophir slide last year and the Battleship Mountain slide in Colorado, multiple burials are real. And again, most of those, especially if you're searching for modern technology, should be easily solved with a marking beacon. But there are scenarios, unfortunately, the United States, if you compare to the rest of, compared to Europe for sure, there's a lot more old technology out there that we're searching for, things like anything, I don't know, anything that's more than 10 years old. There's a lot of it out there that makes searching more difficult. And there are times when having analog tones are incredibly valuable, but that's definitely something that takes quite a bit of skill. So yes, Frank, the reason we don't all have that is because for most people in most scenarios, having a simple digital user interface is going to benefit the most number of people.
Yep, thanks. Looks like there's another one in the Q&A chat. For the signal search phase, would you recommend a particular pattern, or is it largely dependent on the specific terrain?
Well, the pattern is,
that.
Yeah, the pattern is dependent on, the pattern itself is dependent on the number of users, the number of rescuers, and the range of the beacon. So if the recommended search trip width, say this Barry box in front of me is a 70-meter search trip width, and say I've got myself and Patrick and Blake and Frank, and we're all rescuers on scene. If we can spread out 70 meters between all of us, if that's the beacon we're all using, and know that by simply walking straight down the field, the slope, that we're going to have ample coverage of that area, then that would be the pattern of choice. If you're a single rescuer and you can just walk straight down the center of the slope, and you know that your beacon has a range where you're easily going to cover the entire area, then that's certainly going to be the fastest way. The only time you need to do any kind of zigzags are when you don't have the ability to get the full width of the slope simply by walking straight down. So, so for most single searcher scenarios, you would do a zigzag search with the recommended search strip width between your zig and your zag, and half of that recommended search strip width laterally from the sidewalls of the slide. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, I think that was good. Anything else from, John Sidek, do you have a question? We could bring you on live if you want. Otherwise, we'll probably wrap this up in just a second here. We haven't done this yet, so I don't know if it'll work, but.
Maybe we can unmute him. John, you there still?
Do you have the ability to do that, Frank? I'm a little slow with getting to him here.
I'm not as a panelist. I don't believe I can do that.
All right, John, if you want to, you can unmute right now. If not, we'll wrap it up.
Patrick, just if you go into participants list and then click on unmute, should be able to get that from there.
Okay, he says he's all good, so. All right, anything else from, sorry about that. Anything else from any of the panelists, Frank, Blake, Joe?
Nothing here. That was great, Doug. Thanks. Thanks for the tune-up.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great, safe season.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. I appreciate it.
All right.
Doug, thanks a lot. It's great to have you. I loved that approach to teaching about beacon searching. It was very refreshing for me, and I'm sure our audience got a lot out of that. So lastly, we are going to do a quick raffle before we say goodnight to everybody. This is a big one. This one is from Acadia Mountain Guides, who is one of our big supporters over the years of ESA and of the Avalanche Center. AMG is giving away an Airy 1 to somebody for this winter, and they'll be able to connect with the guides about that after the event. We'll connect you via email. So again, thanks to Acadia Mountain Guides. And this Area 1 course is going to Indira Gowell, or Indira Gowell. I'm sorry if I didn't get your name right, but congratulations, and we'll put you in touch with Acadia Mountain Guides. All right, thanks everybody for a great evening. Tomorrow night we'll be back again at 6, and we'll have Mike Austin from Avalanche Geeks presenting on a pretty crazy season in the Alps with COVID last year, and followed by Pascal Hageli talking about some social science research that's going on in the Avalanche world. So we're really excited for tomorrow night. Frank, do you have anything before we wrap it up here?
Nothing for me. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Awesome. Have a great night, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.